Yeah. You're a front row sort of guy. Come on. Front row.
Bad to have the front row in here.
Save one of the seats down here. We want to get you on Carl? Here, Craig.
Come on in. Let's fill up the seats here in the front. Okay, give us about 2 minutes and then we're going to get rolling. Okay, now that we've had our cookies, we're ready for the last session of the day. Other than the night owl tonight, be sure you save some energy to come back at 9:30 tonight for the night owls. And it's really my pleasure to turn the podium and the mic over to Dan Drezner for who will write the rules of the global economy in the 21st century. Dan?
Thank you very much, Craig. Bob Kimmett, at the end of the panel on sovereign wealth funds, talked about the need to have a panel about rewriting the global financial architecture. We actually have that panel here, a fine group of participants. Now, the last time an academic from the city of Boston said anything on the record in Europe, she had to resign from a presidential campaign. So I'm going to try to keep my words to an absolute minimum. But to frame the conversation, I think there are three different ways we can look at who writes the rules. The first is the transatlantic community versus the so-called BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China. On the one hand, you could argue that the transatlantic community still rules the roost. More than 75% of outward foreign direct investment in the world is the United States and the European Union. More than 60% of inward FDI goes to the United States and the European Union. On the other hand, you can also argue the moment has passed. The US and the EU combined are now responsible for less than 40% of global economic output and for less than 30% of global exports. Then we've got the question of public versus private actors. When we talk about writing the rules, there's an almost de facto assumption, perhaps in Europe, that we're talking about public actors. But in fact, increasingly, you're seeing private actors in accounting and other areas. They're also writing the rules. And then finally, we have the elite versus the mass public. For the people in this room, there's a belief that we need to write the rules to keep the global economy open, that globalization is a good thing. But at the same time, if you take a look at public opinion polls, it's not clear that the publics in both Europe and the United States feel the same way. And they're particularly nervous about the shift in economic power from the transatlantic community to countries like China. The GMF Transatlantic Trends poll in 2007 showed that almost a majority of Americans and a plurality of Europeans view China's growth as a threat more than an opportunity. So, with that setting the stage, let's get to our very distinguished panelists. Paul Atkins, Commissioner of the SEC. Let me start with a sort of simple question, which is, in a world where Bear Stearns needs to be bailed out, to what extent do rules matter? In theory, I assume the rules were supposed to prevent something like this from happening. Do we, is it important to even talk about global rules?
Great question, very deep question. Rules do matter because on two different levels. One is rules matter because they help, like with traffic lights or anything else, they help to guide people's actions and businesses' actions. They also help set the boundaries of what's within acceptable limits of behavior and what's outside. But also, especially if rules become skewed and if they're not properly built from a look at costs versus benefits. Rules cost people money and help to skew activity of companies, of investors, of entrepreneurs. And so that's why, at least at the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States, there's a big emphasis right now on looking at our rules from this perspective of cost versus benefit and try to help make our rules much more in sync with human activity.
Now, in terms of writing the rules of the global economy, you can argue maybe there are two ways of going about it. There's sort of a top-down approach where you try to harmonize rules across different jurisdictions, or there's a more bottom-up approach where you allow for mutual recognition, which allows for more diversity but not necessarily as much coordination. You've been involved in the effort of the Transatlantic Economic Council to try to get accounting rules in order. Do you have a preference, or do you think there's one better way than another?
The Transatlantic Economic Council is a great point of showing how things can work out properly. I'm happy to say that we at the Securities and Exchange Commission were able to achieve the first deliverable of the TEC, and that is the United States recognition of international financial reporting standards, which was one of the prime objectives that Chancellor Merkel and President Bush had set out. As far as bottom-up versus top-down, I think the only real way to achieve something, at least within the lifetime of everybody in this room and in the lifetime of my 8-year-old son as well, is to do a top-down approach where we're looking at philosophy, we're looking at how the two jurisdictions are working to achieve common goals and looking at the results, and then going towards a mutual recognition thing. If you do a bottom-up approach, where if you line up all of our regulations on one side versus all of the other jurisdictions' regulation on the other side, see where they're alike, see where they're different, and then try to harmonize them, and then have to maybe go to the national legislature or something like that to get them in sync, it will take forever, and as soon as you go down that road, you'll never achieve things because there will be something like what we saw yesterday that will change the landscape. Thank you.
Jim Quigley, you're the CEO of Deloitte Touche. You're now heading up the Transatlantic Business Dialogue. You've also seen up close the effort to try to coordinate accounting standards through the Transatlantic Economic Council. Do you think this is a possible template for writing other sets of global rules? Is this an exportable template?
I do think the model has the potential of being leverageable. And what happened in this case was we had a private body, International Accounting Standards Board, and they developed some standards that we have judged them to be a single set of high-quality accounting standards that we would like to see globally accepted. And one of the real challenges that you have in an environment like that is, I think, who writes the rules? The answer to that is going to be the regulator writes the rules. And who are the regulators? Those are bodies that receive authority from some political body, some national body. And so in that world then where the regulators will be national, but yet they're trying to write rules for a global market, which our global capital markets truly are, with global enterprises participating in them, how then are you going to get to that common framework? And as Commissioner Atkins just stated, this is a very unique partnership. We do have 100 countries that have said they're going to embrace this set of accounting standards. And I do think that the model is scalable because in this case you have cooperation, you have mutual recognition coming, and I think a way then to try to begin to function with something that is truly global in a truly global market, which the capital markets are, even though regulated by a whole series of national regulators.
This raises an interesting question about going global. The Transatlantic Business Dialogue consists of multinationals, obviously, from the United States and Europe. The multinationals now making the most waves are coming from different countries, from China, from India, and some are private and some are not so private. To what extent do you see the Transatlantic Business Dialogue becoming the global business dialogue?
Well, I think the Transatlantic Business Dialogue is a group of executives from both sides of the Atlantic working to try to influence the public policy agenda. And I think it's too narrow if we say they're just simply looking at transatlantic, because there is an approach to also look at other nations with respect to intellectual property rights protection and our ability to then help, I think, this whole global nation move forward and improve the quality of life and have a framework for barrier-free trade that I believe will improve the quality of living and our ability for these economies to continue to expand.
Ana Palacio, you're a former foreign minister of Spain. You also have some experience with international financial institutions. We were talking before about a possible gap between perception and reality in terms of who actually writes the rules of the global economy. Practically, what do you think are sort of the best venues for this? You know, public agencies versus private, let's say arbitration, for example, arbitration panels.
Well, I think first of all that we have to acknowledge that nowadays perception is at least as important as reality, if not more important. And we cannot forget that. And yesterday in one of the discussions we saw how it was difficult to make our public opinions understand the importance of globalization, and you have raised this issue as well. I don't think that there is a silver bullet or there is a unique formula. What we have to acknowledge nowadays is that the world is very complex. Gone are the days where a group of Europeans and Americans behind closed doors with thick cigars and over thick carpets could decide the fate of the world. Now we have private actors that are extremely active. We have public actors. And we have to cope with this complexity. And yes, there is this big area of public-private partnerships that goes from joint ventures to regulations, as we have seen. And we have to accommodate. There are new models and old institutions that are being adapted. Arbitration, you have mentioned arbitration. This is a very interesting case because arbitration was born to address private differences or private conflicts.
Commercial arbitration between
yes, commercial
private actors.
Well,
right.
but arbitration is, in the origin is commercial arbitration between two private parties. No public interest dimension. Nowadays, arbitration has gone, and a couple of days or 3 days ago, there was an article in the Financial Times. Arbitration has grown up and has gone to be one of the instruments to solve conflicts between a state and a private investor, a foreign private investor. And there, of course, you cannot ignore the public interest dimension, the role of public opinion. How can you explain to this public opinion that will equate arbitration to the jurisdiction, to what they know, the judges, that it's very common in arbitration that you have a 3-members panel, that you find these 3 members in another case, one being counsel for one party, the other one being counsel for the other party, and the third one being still an arbitrator. Or that in arbitration there is no jurisprudence, that you have the cases in Argentina where the idea of state of necessity was interpreted by different arbitration panels in a very different way. And we have to cope with this. And so we have to adapt old institutions and we have to address new institutions to cope with these private-public interactions that have nothing to do with the old models.
Vice President Gunter Verheugen, there's clearly a call for, the United States and the European Union to get together to potentially write the rules. Maybe this is a moment where the rules still can be written by these actors, and then bringing China and India and other actors in. But Ana Palacio raises a valid question. To what extent will writing these rules create a public backlash? Presumably, to write the rules, Americans and Europeans are used to a democratic process, but regulatory standards are not usually written in a democratic way. To what extent will these kinds of rules provoke public backlash against globalization, against economic openness?
No, in the contrary, I do not believe that we create a backlash in public opinion. What we are doing is just to explain our public that globalization is basically good for everybody in the United States and in the European Union, but that, of course, that we need some rules in order to guarantee that competition is fair and equal. This is what people rightly expect, and of course, rules are not written behind closed doors. Finally, it is always a process of legislation, and has to be done in parliamentary institutions, and that's exactly what happens. What I see today is another danger. The danger that I see is that policymakers, in particular at national level, in the United States, in the European Union, even in the country I know best, react in the wrong way on the uncertainties and fears which people feel. I think that the majority of our citizens see globalization as a threat and not as a challenge. And what I see today is that more and more policymakers in Europe and US echo the very popular mood, instead of giving clear guidance and leadership and telling people why we have to compete, how we have to compete, but that we can win the competition.
Do you think it's possible to educate the public? I mean, I can think of citizens in the state of Ohio, Pennsylvania, France, that might be somewhat resistant to this idea, no matter how many times you explain it to them.
Exactly. I know that the most recent example, and I've expected that when I saw it, that EIDS won a big contract to the United States. My immediate reaction was, this is not yet finished, and just the next day already, it started. And this is a protectionist reflex that we see very often. But we should have learned a lesson from the crises in the 20th century. Closed markets are always wrong. Yeah, closed markets create damage, and closed markets create poverty. The only way to solve the problem is to stick to the line, to defend open markets, to defend free trade, to fight against protectionism. And the United States and Europeans, we can survive that, and we can even succeed in that competition if we improve our own capacities.
Dr.André Sapir, you've written far and wide about the EU as an actor in the global economy. And there seems to be a paradox with regard to the European Union. On the one hand, it's considered to be a global standard setter in a lot of areas. On the other hand, it's not clear in other areas where it has any competency whatsoever. This is very difficult for Americans to understand. In fact, if I ever want to put my students to sleep, I just say the word comatology and watch the eyes go flutter. But the fact is, I'm not sure there's as much understanding in Europe as well. Maybe you can enlighten us. Does the EU need to reform its own governance in order to be able to write the rules?
Okay, first let me come back to the first statement that you said at the beginning of your presentation, when you indicated that the EU and the US only account now for about, together, a bit less than 40% of world trade. Mm-hmm. And obviously the emerging countries and China, first and foremost, is rising very, very quickly as a trading power and as an economic power. Nonetheless, I think it's still the case today that probably well over 80% of the global rules are written in Europe and in the United States. Mm-hmm. That's point number one. Now, point number two is your question, what kind of actor is Europe on the global scene, both on the rule setting and in other economic issues? And I think I share the view that you put forward. It's a very diverse actor. Well, if you look at competition policy, the EU is a unitary actor, and it's an actor that speaks with one voice, that acts with the Commission forcefully so, and can discuss with Washington, with Tokyo, with other actors on a one-to-one basis. In other areas, well, look at Paul's area. Yes, he comes and speaks to the Commission, but he has also clearly to speak to other actors in Europe, because we know in Europe we have many financial regulators. We have dozens of financial regulators in Europe. So you're right, the situation is what I've called messy. And it's messy when you look over the whole gamut of areas. I think what is, when I'm looking ahead, what I'm seeing is that, in a sense, we have come through 50 years of integration. You know, last year we celebrated 50 years of the Treaty of Rome.
Congratulations.
And that's right. And in a sense, the first 50 years were really, in a sense, inevitably inward-looking. It was about integrating ourselves, more countries, more policies. And now we are in a totally different situations. I mean, we have more or less integrated ourselves. I mean, it's not finished. It's always something in the making. But we have moved very much forward. And at the same time, now the world is extremely different. And I think one can ask genuinely whether one needs, and I believe one does need at the global level, to rethink a number of the global governance matters. I mean, some have called for a new Bretton Woods conference. And I don't know whether we are going to get a new Bretton Woods conference, but one feels that one needs something like that. One does need to bring the Chinas and the Indias and the Brazil on board. And in order to do that, for Europe to be able to sit at the table and to speak with a voice that is being heard, indeed, Europe needs to reform itself. And now what it needs to do is indeed look towards the 21st century, having come from the 20th century, move into the 21st century, look at the challenges, and the challenges does indeed require quite a bit of reforms of governance, the way we are functioning, or governance of our own rules making, in order for us to be able to play a role in global governance.
Oh, this leads to a paradox. As you say, you don't want the EU to be inward-looking, but presumably any kind of reform of its own governance structure demands that it be inward-looking, to at least in the short term. Do you think it's possible for the EU to engage in these kinds of reforms? We know perhaps you think they should, but can they, politically?
Right. Look, I think we are going to get now a test in the coming years with this new treaty, the Lisbon Treaty. We know we don't have a minister for foreign affairs, but so we have a high representative.
Not so-called. Not so-called minister for foreign
Not so-called. But we have now this new post of the high representative in charge of foreign affairs. Now, and as you read the press and you read the columns in the different newspapers, you see it's rather messy. No, how is this person going to fit vis-à-vis the President of the Commission and the President of Europe? But clearly there is the recognition that there is a need to have something move forward. How long it will take? I'm sure the first few years is going to be very inward-looking. It's going to be lots of fights about putting order between those three different posts. Who is doing what? Who is in charge of what? And I'm sure that initially is going to be extremely inward-looking. But hopefully it's not going to last too long. And depending on the persons who will be appointed, one hopes that one will be able to cement the inward tendency and rise to the challenge. And the challenge, there are plenty. I mean, we have been hearing throughout the conference what are the challenges, whether it's the challenges on our borders, the Mediterranean countries, Russia, whether it's the global challenges. They are everywhere, the challenges. So, hopefully this pressure from outside will force us from inside to get our house together.
You talked about bringing China and India into the global governance structures. Now we'd like to bring the audience into this conversation. If you have any questions for this distinguished panel, please, let me see your hands. Beard, yes. Mike's coming on the other side.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pierre Lehmann, Avion Group at IMD. The global economy of the 21st century, one of the things that's interested me so far is that there's been very little talk of demographics. And I'll give a figure. If it's wrong, correct me, but I believe that currently the West, and I include Russia and Turkey, correspond to about 16%, 17% of the world's population and going down. I gave another figure at lunchtime. For those who were there, I apologize for repeating it. But if you look at the population of people aged between 12 and 24, there are 1.5 billion, and 87% of them are in developing countries. So that gives you an idea, I think. I mean, that's reality. And as I said, demographics is destiny of what kind of global economy that we're going to be in. It was also pointed out quite correctly that in the EU and to a certain extent the United States, there's a strong feeling against globalization. This is in complete contrast with the situation in Vietnam, in China, in Bangladesh, in lots of Latin American countries, etc., where people are extremely gung-ho about globalization. What they would like is a lot more globalization. Now, I think the question is, when you come to write rules, do you ask the people who write rules, and I think we need new rules for the 21st century, we've got a different environment, is it the people who don't want to play who should write the rules, or is it the people who want to play and want to have a more dynamic global environment who should be invited to write the rules, and we can help them, with the odd comma here or full stop there?
Shall I,
please.
Shall I start? I share your view. And I must say that the demographic factor is one of the most important reasons for the economic strategy that we have in place. The acknowledgement that Europe must urgently improve competitiveness is also built on the fact that our aging population in the European Union will create strong pressure on the traditional welfare state. We will not be in a position to finance it if we do not change some structures. And therefore, in my view, and in the view of the European Commission, globalization is an excellent opportunity to improve and to strengthen our economic base. And now coming to the question of the rules. What I see as a tendency since a couple of years is that our rulemaking is, let me say, more and more vindicated. We are pulling more and more partners in. It's now G8, WTO, despite the fact that the present Doha round is at a regrettable state. I know, but in principle, you see that more and more emerging economies want to be part of the system that we have created, and I have to confess that we have certainly ruled for decades. So ideally, we would set the rules in an international, global, multilateral context. To give you one example where there is no way to avoid it, we cannot create a global low-carbon economy without global governance. Yesterday and the day before, we had the European Summit here in Brussels. I'm just coming from it, and it was obvious that all our efforts in the European Union and the efforts that will certainly come in the United States will not help very much if we cannot bring the emerging economies in. And the only way to do it is to treat them as equals. Another example is what we are doing, the United States and the Europeans now together in the Transatlantic Economic Council. It was already mentioned. We're not going to details here, but what I want to say, I see it on the long run as an exercise in global leadership. If we can successfully prove that we are able to remove non-tariff barriers and obstacles for trade, and that we are able to find convergence in regulatory matters, we can easily export that to other parts of the world. And I can tell you that since we have this instrument, the interest in countries like China, Japan, to discuss similar matters with us is much stronger than it used to be in the past. So I see some good signs, not only the bad mood that I have presented in my first statement when saying that globalization is seen as a threat. I see also that policy making can make a difference.
Anna, you wanted to weigh in as well?
Well, the first thing that occurs to me with your question is that in this forum we have to realize that the United States has Atlantic and has Pacific, and that the big demographic push is in the Pacific. And I think that this should make us reflect on giving a content to this transatlantic relationship. This is the first comment. The second comment, well, although we are old, and in Europe we are happy to be old societies, and we cope with this, I think that being old is not equivalent to having to be written off. And I think that, yes, I think that Europe proves that. I think that the most interesting experience of precisely listening and precisely reaching agreements, taking on board and adding up different perspectives is the European Union, this fantastic achievement of old Europe in the first place. So having said that, do I think that we have to address this issue? Yes. André Sapir mentioned that we need a new Bretton Woods. Well, first of all, in this symbolic level that I mentioned that is so important because perceptions are so important, we have to address the existing Bretton Woods institutions and the voice and representation there. And even if, as Bob Zoellick, the president of the World Bank, yesterday mentioned that the changes will not be big, the symbolic message is there. I think that there Europe must react and address that, as Bob Zoellick said, that there are 8 chairs that are. This is a way to count it, but at least there are 3 chairs that are Europeans and that are just Germany, just France, and just the UK. The others are shared chairs that they share with other countries. So we have to address this issue. Yes, we have the multilateral institutions. Let's begin by that.
Jim?
I just wanted to replace the word challenge with opportunity, because I think we're talking about this in the spirit of a win-lose, that if there are other players that come on the stage and they have stronger power than perhaps we might have once enjoyed as a US-EU, that we're somehow losing. And I'd like to replace that thought with, what a tremendous opportunity as this economy diversifies and as new players come. And I believe who will write the rules for the economy in the 21st century will be those who choose to participate in the economy in the 21st century. And one proof point for that is, I think customers have a very strong voice. And so when Walmart decides we're only going to carry Blu-ray, all of a sudden the war is over with respect to Blu-ray versus high-definition DVD. And I think the customer will write the rules. And having the U.S. economy slow down, but yet have real growth in exports to China and India and Russia and Brazil, that's terrific, because it mitigates the impact of that U.S. slowdown of what it would have otherwise been. But we have to think about it in terms of the opportunity, not the challenge in a win-lose kind of way.
Question down here.
Yeah, Vivian Schmidt, Boston University and Sciences Po. I'd like to come back to the question of globalization and offshoring. And I guess the big question is, who are the winners and losers of globalization? And I think it's a question of which countries, or let's say in Europe and regions in the U.S., and what about types of workers? We know that it was first manufacturing, now we see it increasingly in services. So how do you respond to the real problems and the fears that people have? So one is, how do you respond to the public's concerns? What kind of discourse do you provide? And then what kinds of reforms, and in which countries? So is it, we hear for Europe, it's generally continental Europe, it's France, Germany, and Italy, it's the Midwest in the U.S. So what kinds of reforms? And then I guess the final question is, when you listen to EU leaders, Barroso and Merkel talk about shaping globalization. Sarkozy talks about protecting in globalization. What does this mean? How do you do this, especially now that you're talking about having to have global rules and not simply European and American rules? Thank you.
André, I will give you the very challenging task of interpreting President Sarkozy.
I'm going to take the first part of your question. And
taking the academics route out.
the way I'm going to answer the first part of your question is in the following manner. When those Eurobarometers, those polls that are asked throughout Europe, same questions, and there are always questions about globalization. Now, when you ask the citizens of Europe about globalization, do they feel that globalization is an opportunity, the way most of us would put it, or is it a threat? Clearly, the majority sees it as a threat. Now, let's look a little bit more finely. What kind of characteristics? And as one would expect, if you look at personal characteristics, well, younger individuals are more optimistic, older ones less. More educated, they see it more as an opportunity. Less educated, they see it more as a threat. That's what you would expect. But the more interesting element is to look across countries. Because indeed, if you look at the same question being posed throughout Europe, the 27 countries, it runs from some countries which sees it mostly as an opportunity to some that sees it almost 100% as a threat. And it's interesting to see which country, can you try to detect why is it that some countries are positioned on one end and why is it that countries are positioned on the other hand? Now, by my reading, obviously different people will have different reading, my reading is that there is a very strong correlation between the way, I'm talking across the European system, and then I'm going to come to the US, there's a very strong correlation between the social kind of systems, how the social systems, the social models, because as I've tried to argue otherwise, there is not a European social model. I mean, that's all nonsense. There are European social models. There are a variety of European social models. And some of those social models are operating rather well in today's world, which is a world of rapid change. And some of those models, yes, you can see it's rather the Scandinavian, but to some extent also the Anglo-Saxon. And yes, France is on one hand. And yes, Denmark is on the other. There's no doubt about that. And then you see different countries where they are, and it's very, very strongly correlated. So in some countries, yes, they are able, and all the discussion there is in Europe, I think, and quite rightly so, flex security. I mean, this is the kind of things that one needs. One needs models that people feel can respond to those changes, because changes are going to be there, whether it's called globalization, called technological change, called aging, called climate change, however you want to call it, it's going to be change. And change is going to create this kind of issue. Now, the last thing I want to say about this, there's a problem also in the US. Now, and I think quite rightly in this campaign today, the health system has come at the top. I mean, this is a major, major problem for American society. Because health is also, I mean, people are fearing for their jobs because jobs go together with health system. So again, one needs this kind of, also part of the social reform. So this is what I would answer to you.
Steve Clemens.
Thank you, Dan. I want to come back in part to Dan's earlier question about backlash, but perhaps this won't make sense, and it's the wrong place to do this. But it seems to me, in the 1990s, globalization, economic integration had a kind of profound momentum, sort of Tom Friedman-esque, Goldman, sort of golden straitjacket determinism. There was a convergent a view of convergence of all societies. That seems to be over. And I sit in a lot of discussions, and to some degree in Dan's comments about backlash, some of the stress you mentioned gets at this. The discussion about sovereign wealth funds, to me, seems to be a manifestation of a very different kind of order, and I'm wondering if we need to sort of rethink globalization as a concept. Globalization, in my mind, was sort of an integration, a high trust integration, higher and higher trust networks of moving people, institutions, and ideas across borders. But borders seem to be back. They seem to be thicker. There seem to be more in the self-determination movements. Sovereign wealth funds are themselves a kind of check, if you will, a shock absorber because of the lack of trust in the international system after the East Asian economic shocks in 97, 98. And so to some degree, I wonder what, do we need to be talking about what high fear globalization looks like as opposed to high trust globalization? In these kinds of discussions, I don't see any real paradigm shift, that everything seems to be going towards an integration and towards a view of this, like it used to be in the 90s. But to me, when you look empirically, there's lots of stuff that seems different.
Well, one thought on that. If you look at the financial markets as sort of a bellwether of people's attitudes, because money is, very fluid, very liquid, and really does move around the world these days, lightning speed and very quickly. There's been a profound shift over the last 10, 20 years as to barriers. There are no more barriers, basically, in effect, in the financial markets because countries have found that they don't work. The last time, say, France decided to try to do something with respect to the financial markets, they quickly found, this is when Mitterrand first came in 1980 or whenever, quickly found that it was ineffective, and France had to dismantle those barriers.
Malaysia did have better luck, though.
Well, arguably, although in the long term, it came back. But a lot of this is powered by customer and investor reaction, and so then that powers how firms go about to try to meet those sorts of needs. And if you look at, I guess generally, the disconnect is, this goes for all three questions really, is how do we educate people as to the benefits of globalization and the realities. A lot of people see the negatives, they don't see the positives, and I think that's really the challenge for politicians ultimately to try to get that across.
If you're allowed to make a short remark here, I'm now serving in the second European Commission, and I wouldn't agree to say that the momentum is slowing down. Just on the contrary, I see a strong change, even a change of paradigms, shift of paradigms. In my first term, I would agree that Europe was very reluctant to tackle the challenge or the opportunity of globalization. But now we do it. Shaping globalization in the language of the European Commission means to make Europe fit, prepared for global competition. The message that we have for our economy is we do not protect you. The issue is, the message is you have to compete. And what we try to do is, in a multilateral framework, to create framework conditions which are fair and which are beneficial, not only for you, but also for our competitors worldwide. I would fully agree to say that we need to make globalization a win-win situation for both sides. It's not a zero-sum game. It is, so far as I can see it today, it's a development that benefits both sides. We have seen in the developing countries hundreds of millions of people coming out of misery and poverty, and they are now market participants. And that will increase, of course. They start with a small car, and after 10, 15 years, they want to have a Mercedes or a BMW. It's quite clear. And in the European Union, we can clearly see those countries which have started to restructure the society and the economy to build a knowledge-based society and a knowledge-based economy combined with flexible labor markets, combined with strong innovative capacities, these societies and economies are winner. And that's the model that we want to have everywhere in Europe. That's the whole substance of the strategy that we have in place.
The gentleman in the back there.
Patrick Messalin, Sciences Po in Paris. I am a little bit uneasy about what has been said until now, because I got the impression that basically things are going pretty well, even if it is messy, but the community, on one hand, the European community and the US are writing the rules. That doesn't fit the facts that you can look at. When you look at the indicators, either the index of freedom, the doing business database, all the database you can have, and the OECD restrictiveness index, all these database says it doesn't work this way. The countries, for example, if I take Europe, some countries are going very well, very quickly, going from a very backward situation. Others going from the front of the situation in the mid-70s. France and Germany was the least regulated countries in this time. Now they are, of course, backwards.
Germany is backward?
So it means in the mid-70s we were less regulated than the US. But if you look at that, it's really what the impression you have, it's a kind of competition between the countries, even between the member states. The last example I will take is the better regulation movement in Europe, which in fact has really been launched by Ireland, by the Netherlands, then joined by Germany, and finally to these days France is saying maybe we should join the club. So it's not something which is going from Brussels, it's something which is coming from the capital cities, which are just taking the risk to improve their regulations independently from the whole world. It's a competition world between between states and member states within the community. That's the figures.
I'm not sure there was a question there. I think it was more of a comment. But
I would say I strongly disagree. Strongly disagree. Figures don't show that. And one thing is obvious: the stronger performance of the European economies that we see now, in particular in Germany, the stronger is a result of policy changes in Europe. Macroeconomic conditions have changed as a result of the introduction of the single currency. We have a culture of stability that we have never seen in European member states before. And that, by the way, if I am allowed to say that, makes the big difference between the European Union of today, or the Eurozone of today, and the United States. We have strong macroeconomic stability that makes us less vulnerable. And number two is we have completed the internal market. And that again makes us less vulnerable. The internal market was not completed a couple of years ago. It's now developing strongly, and the biggest part of the economic activities in European member states, activities in the internal market and among the participants of the internal market. And the third element, what you should never forget, I know that you have discussed the enlargement of the European Union at an earlier session, but I would like to make the point, since I had something to do with it, that we have emerging economies, emerging regions in the European Union as well. Eastern and Central Europe is central for the recovery that we have seen, and central for the high growth rates, for the high employment rate, and the falling unemployment, because they create strong demand in the old member states. So I'm certainly not do not want to paint a too rosy picture. But sometimes we are not very good at selling what we have already done. We always discuss what we still have to do, but I would like to mention that we have already achieved something.
Gentleman in the front.
Ken Wallach with the National Democratic Institute. I wanted to get back to the questions of communication and dialogue between those setting the rules and those feeling left out by the process. And the Commissioner talked about this being a challenge. I remember during the 1970s in the Peres government in Israel, when they were forced into a social pact between government, business, and labor to deal with runaway inflation that was going to lead to the immediate 20% reduction in the standard of living. And I remember the then Treasury Secretary, Finance Secretary, Gad Yacobi, emphasized this notion of communication with the public. And he told the story of the man who was sentenced to the electric chair. And on execution day, he began to sit down, but he weighed 200 kilos, and he couldn't fit in the chair. And the executioner said, "Do you mind losing 50 kilos?" He said, "I don't mind, but you're giving me no incentive." The question is, what are the incentives? What mechanisms can be used to communicate those incentives to those who are fearing this process? Or what mechanisms should be established for communication and dialogue?
Anna, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I think that this is the €1 million questions, and it's a big challenge. Once more, I will go back to what André Sapir said. In Europe, where, as Commissioner Verheugen has said, we have everything from extremely developed to emerging economies, we have seen that there are certain political approaches that work, and the Nordic Scandinavian countries have been particularly good at that.
But you have the highest taxes and the highest statehood, not to forget.
Exactly.
Highest taxes. The highest.
The highest taxes, but at the same time a system...
Yeah, the Americans normally would not appreciate that, huh?
So I think that there are best practices out there that can be studied and adapted. And from a European perspective, what is really concerning is, for instance, the debate in the presidential campaign in the United States, where we see suddenly just two candidates disavowing what has been one of the foundations of this system that we are set to defend and to promote. So there are best practices, and there are I would say, very difficult to understand practices. And I think that we have the choice, all of us. There is a responsibility there, and politicians have to take it.
The woman in the back there.
I'm most probably, since I come from Prague, one of the real benefiters of Europe integration, globalization, transformation, liberalization, and as we call it.
Could you give us your name, please? I'm sorry.
Jana Hybášková, member of European Parliament. Nevertheless, I would like to point to the fact that the syndrome of standard of Californian car is not applicable everywhere. And we have a problem that some goes for higher standards and some others simply try to buy the cheapest thing and not to work and not to engage. We can speak about globalization in Malaysia, in Vietnam, which were mentioned here, in China. But unfortunately, if we look to Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, and I would really like to point to Egypt, I would like to pose the question, if we, EU and US, set 80% of global rules, which kind of rules are you really going to apply to get especially Egyptian economy to become part of global economy? Because what is happening in this part of the world, we all know that in the center of Cairo we have fastly growing rich people, very, very few amount, and we have almost 60 million people who are absolutely left out of globalization, which are just on the banks of the sea, which we call our inner sea. And not speaking about the repercussions for security and war, but speaking about the repercussions for our direct neighborhood. So which kind of rules, not the competition question, are we going to apply to them? Thank you.
This is, Anna,
No, go ahead.
No, I mean this because this is not such a complicated question. We have regulatory dialogues, as we call that, with all the countries in our neighborhood, and the aim is, of course, to create regulatory convergence. Well, the normal way is that we help our neighbors in the partnership agreements which we negotiate with them to implement rules which already exist in the European Union and have proven to be successful and valuable. So the deal is very clear. We offer free access to the most important, biggest and strongest market in the world. It is the market of the European Union. We offer that. But we tell them, our partners, there are rules which need to be accepted. But we don't impose the rules on them. We don't impose them. We develop them, we discuss them, and we help them to implement the rules. These are sometimes, often they are extremely technical. The biggest part of the rules which we are discussing here are technical standards. And when I started my present job, I found it extremely boring to deal with standardization. Now I deal with standardization every day, and I know it's an exciting because there's the real competition. Who sets the technical standards?
I wrote a whole book about this, so I agree with you.
Along with the final sentence, my policy is not that the European Union or the Americans set the standards and everybody else must follow. I want to do that in international fora and international body, and we do it more and more in Geneva. We do it more and more in the framework of the OECD, and we can also do it more and more in the framework of the WTO.
André, you wanted to add something?
I don't know whether I agree that it's an easy question. I think it's an interesting question. And I think that allows me to branch to, I think, a very important topic on which Commissioner Verheugen, in a sense, which he addressed just a second ago, are the free trade areas. I mean, there's clearly a proliferation of free trade agreements, and in particular free trade agreements that are centered either on the EU or on the US. Yeah. We have many free trade agreements. Not the US has many. Some of them signed, not yet ratified, maybe never ratified, but they're there, right? They're the Koreas, and we have Morocco. The US is Morocco. Now, the new free trade areas, the free trade agreements, they are different from the previous ones, right? The previous ones, they were really dealing with trade. It was about tariffs, right? The traditional free trade areas. The new ones, they're about regulatory matters. And the question which I find not so easy to answer, to which I personally don't have an answer, because I see the pluses and minuses there. In a sense, there is a competition, no doubt, between the EU and the US on this front, despite some of the rhetoric. There is clearly a competition, because there is the element that each of us are setting the rules, and we feel through those new generation of free trade agreements, we are extending our rules. And you can say, well, to some extent, well, let's say, take Egypt. Egypt is in the Mediterranean Union. Those are neighbors. They are countries with whom we trade a lot. They trade mostly with us, and it's maybe natural. But at the same time, you are fragmenting the trading system or the regulatory system, right? So we are doing it not just because we think that Egypt should have our rules, and having our rules is a great thing. We also think that gives us a competitive advantage. Okay? We are not just doing it for Egypt's interest, we are also doing it for our interest. And our interest means necessarily at the expense of somebody else's interest, whether it's the US or whether it's China or Japan or Korea. So this issue of extending our regulatory system, which has pluses, because some of those countries do need a much better regulatory system. That's the good side. The bad side is that there is a competitive element vis-à-vis other partners, that we are doing it for the interest, naturally, of our companies at the expense of somebody else. And, where are we going? So you see in some countries, you have free trade agreements of this generation by the EU and by the US, and you say, well, there we have a level playing field. What about all the other countries? What about India? What about Japan? What about Korea? What about Brazil? So, yes, we are saying we should do this multilaterally, but in a sense, it's very hard to do this regulatory system at a multilateral. I mean, it's desirable, but the reality is that it is at a more national level.
It's interesting that you say that there would be problems, that it would be perceived as unfair. It's not a level playing field if we let in Japanese or Indian or Brazilians. Of course, from those countries' perspectives, the current system is already unfair. And the question is, how do you reform that? Anna, you had a short intervention?
I normally, being a lawyer by training, I normally underscore the importance of rules. But honestly, we, the European Union, and I come from Spain, another country that really benefited from there. Of course, rules are important, but let me just, you pointed out the southern border of the Mediterranean. What is striking is the lack of integration, of vertebration of these countries. So you may have all the free trade agreements, but you need to bring these goods to a port, you need to have roads. And what really made the difference for us in Spain? It was not that much the rules of the European Union, but honestly the possibility to vertebrate the country. And this is where the common effort of the international community, plus these countries, they have to address this, the education system, other basic areas. President Bob Zoellick yesterday highlighted that one of the priorities of the World Bank of the 21st century in this idea of the inclusive and sustainable globalization is the Arab world. And the Arab world, because of this, because the Arab world has certain characteristics that contrast. The Ummah is a symbolic thing that does not translate into the real daily life of the people that live in this region.
Paul, you wanted to say
one
quickly?
last quick point, too, because I agree with these points. We can pretend in the West to set rules, and we do, obviously, but we have to realize that we don't set them in a vacuum, that there has to be a balance between cost and benefit. And if you look at the global capital markets, and you look at emerging countries like Egypt and others, there are entrepreneurs there who have great ideas, probably, but they have a lack of access to capital. But that's changing. And if you look at Hernando de Soto, is a Peruvian economist who wrote a great book called The Mystery of Capital, which I commend to your reading, where he did a study with the World Bank to look at a number of different emerging market countries to figure out, now, why are they not developing like they should? And he came across, his theory is there's dead capital there. There's not an ability for people to either borrow money, put up collateral, and have access to capital. That will soon change. I'm sorry?
Lack of property rights.
Exactly. And that will soon change. change, and it is changing in Egypt and other countries. So we in the West have had fertile soil for entrepreneurs like Gottlieb Daimler and Carl Benson, Alexander Graham Bell and Bill Gates and others to have access to capital and build great companies and great ideas that answer the needs of consumers. But we can't rely just on that, that sooner or later around the world that people will soon have access and come up.
How can you have property rights if you do not have a legal existence? Many people in these countries do not have a legal existence. There is no registry. They don't have a legal personality. So I think that this problem is a huge one.
Yes.
The Bertelsmann Foundation, I have a question that comes more from the foreign policy perspective. This discussion, as a couple of other discussions here these days, are kind of inspired by the assumption that we're on the eve of something else. You know, that there's a paradigm shift, or that the world is not going to be the same soon. On the other hand, I get the impression that we act as if we still had quite a lot of time. So I'm asking myself, are we using the moment, or are we losing time on this? And for example, I wonder, why don't we have a kind of momentum within the European Union to spend at least, let's say, 20% of the energy we invested in the QMV reform on empowering the Commission with a single mandate for all of the tradable items. It has to do with member state competition, that in part of the services, the member state still reserve rights that should belong into a singular spot. On the issue of regulatory convergence, we have now in the transatlantic marketplace brought this up. I think we should be much further down the line on this. On the issue of agricultural subsidies, when, if not now, that prices are skyrocketing for agricultural products, do we have the opportunity to put this issue behind us? I do not see, there may be movement behind the scenes that I'm not aware of, but I do not see that we're really trying to clear up the agenda, because there is another one looming on the horizon. And finally, shouldn't we embark on a strategy not only to try to draw the BRICS countries into kind of regulatory exchanges and regimes, but specifically draw in the smaller emerging markets in order to create an environment also for the larger countries within the European Union, using the impact of bringing around a larger number of smaller countries has always been beneficial. And shouldn't we not also use this on the global scale? And finally, that's a specific question to Anna Palacio and Gunter Verheugen. If we do not exclude that in the end, some of this rule bargaining will be pretty much 19th century dealing of great powers among themselves, how do we prepare Europe for that kind of business? How are we prepared to engage into dialogues when other actors not only speak about rules and regulations, but bring in their sheer size and power to the table?
I actually want to go to Jim first, to go back to Joseph's first question, which is, frankly, you work in the private sector, you're used to things going relatively quickly. When it comes to regulatory convergence, writing the rules, are we just too damn slow?
I think that democracies, just by their very nature, are slow and somewhat plodding, and we have a hard time giving up power. But I think that the notion of, can we set some standards at a global basis with some private sector body, what I think the accounting model has actually provided to us, and then have that embraced with national regulators who will then oversee how those standards get implemented. And let's let all the participants in that global economy help us set the standards. And I think then we can take some of these steps forward. But I actually believe that we are taking very significant steps forward. When I go to Shanghai and Beijing, it looks to me like they're moving. And when they talk to me about 350 million people lifted from abject poverty as a product of globalization, I think some things are working. I was in Sao Paulo last week. It takes an hour and a half to get to the airport because there's 800 new cars coming to the road every single day as we have millions of new participants in that economy, and they haven't yet built the infrastructure to go with all of this newfound affluent participants in the economy. But I think globalization is there's a lot to like about what globalization is doing for us also in the Western world.
I think the question for Anna and for me was whether Europe accepts the role as a global player in the 21st century or not. And this is, for me, also the big question and the real issue. And this question is not decided, to be very frank. It's not decided. Economically, we are very strong, and we are developing our capacity to defend our economic interests, to set global rules. Economically, we are a global player. There is no doubt. I would even correct one of your points. In trade policy, I think that the empowerment of the European Commission is not less than the empowerment of the US administration. I have now a lot of experience with that. So, there is not such a big difference. I think we might be even a little bit stronger. So that's not the point. But do we have a global strategy? Are we able to implement it? The answer today is no. But I share André Sapir's view, what he has said earlier. The new treaty might start a new era. The whole thing why we needed the new treaty was exactly to answer that question. How will Europe react if and when, and I'm absolutely sure it will happen, the economic multipolarism that is developing will turn into political multipolarism. If we have the multipolar world, rising powers, world powers, which role will Europe play? And that's therefore my answer is, it is historically inevitable that European integration will go further. This is not the end. This is not at the end of the story. And I promise you, during our lifetime, it depends on our state of health, of course, but in principle, I believe that during our lifetime, we will see the political union that makes Europe a truly global political player.
Well, just a couple of sentences. I fully agree that this is this issue of inward looking. I will add another dimension. I think that many times, and Commissioner Verheugen raised this issue as well, many times we Europeans, we do not realize what we have achieved. And we are loaded by our history, by a very complex and complicated history, and we do not believe. If I'm not just accused of plagiarism, we really should say yes, we can. Yes, we can be at the leadership of this process of globalization.
I don't have much experience as moderator, but one rule of thumb I always have is that if Bruce Stokes has a question, I'll call on him. Bruce?
Bruce Stokes, the National Journal. I want to follow up on Joe's question that puts this in a time frame context, because it seems to me that issue of a relevant time frame is terribly pressing on this point. It may well be true that over time, who sets the rules has to be broadened to include other people, but the experience of the Doha round is that for a variety of reasons, those players are not ready or willing. The Indians need a generation to adjust their agricultural system. The Chinese seem to be doing very well, thank you very much, and so why should they play? And I think that we need to address those issues on rule setting over which we have some control, which is the transatlantic rule setting exercise that has been alluded to. And with all deference to the accounting standards issue, it seems to me that may turn out to be a special case. Where we had the U.S. Congress pass a train wreck of a law that forced the issue. The transatlantic rule-setting process doesn't have a whole lot of other successful credits to its more than decade-long process. So I guess the challenge that I would put to all of you is, why do we think we can, in the near term, in the transatlantic context, be any better at setting rules between ourselves than we have been to date?
Thanks, Bruce. Although one should add that if we're counting on stupid laws to promote convergence, we shouldn't have any problem in terms of a supply for that. Does anyone want to offer an answer?
Well,
yeah.
Here's one to venture and to take off on the yes we can, yes we must, basically, because, again, the world is getting smaller all the time. And I think the one thing that, at least speaking for regulators on both sides of the Atlantic, we realize that we share so much affinity from history, culture, business relationships, and you see the growing number of international groups, and starting from the top with the Transatlantic Economic Council, the TABD, and the Transatlantic Investment Dialogue, and those other sorts of groups. Everything sort of needs a little bit of time to get momentum, but if you look at the current economic turmoil in the marketplace, and you see the coordinated activity just this week by central bankers on Monday and elsewhere, I think you're seeing much more realization that, yes, our rules need to be much more integrated, and the two sides of the Atlantic have to stop talking about us versus them, but it really is us in the end.
Well, I fully agree. I mean, there are success stories, but there are many just near misses. One of them, just to mention, but one, the data protection. Data protection is one of these systems that it's absolutely convoluted. It's crazy how we developed our data protection directive without any dialogue with the United States. And when we had the directive and we had to implement the directive, we were in a position where most of our companies that have one American face and one European face could not transfer, say, from Brussels to Atlanta, the data. So you are right. This is an area where nobody can rationally understand why we are not being much more effective. There are some attempts to that, and in the end, I think. I mean, I'm a born optimist. So I think that we must, and I think that the business community, by getting together, and there's transatlantic business dialogue is a good example, and Erika Mann, who is there, is one of the big players in the European Parliament. This is the kind of pressure that both legislators need to just be more rational.
There are many perks
to.
to.
The last word is leadership. We need leadership in this.
There are many perks that come with being a Brussels Forum moderator. I'm going to take advantage of one of them and ask you the final question. You can also give your summary comments, which is there are a variety of important international institutions, Bretton Woods institutions, and the problem is they were all created mostly between 1945 and 1955. The distribution of power in the world looks a little bit different now. The question becomes, what's going to be easier? Would you rather try to reform the existing institutions, and these are important ones, or should we just try to create new ones on top of the old ones?
Well, clearly reform them. The Bretton Woods institution, the World Bank in particular, was created to reconstruct Europe, mainly. But it was reinvented already during the decolonization, the independence period, as a tool of the international community, the free world, to compete with the communist world by having access or giving access to the developing countries, access to the international capital market. So we have already transformed once these institutions, and I think, frankly, I think that from the World Bank and from the fund, I think that there is a clear conscience, and at least at the World Bank, there is a clear strategy to just respond to these new challenges.
Well, in principle, I do believe in Schumpeter's constructive destruction.
Creative destruction, yeah.
Yeah, in principle, yes. But as far as international institutions are concerned, I would be careful. And I would follow Ana de Palacio's advice to build on the existing institutions, but certainly to modernize them and to adjust. But my point is another one. The Bretton Woods institutions were made under completely different economic and political conditions, and they do not meet some of the challenges which we have in the 21st century. For instance, they are certainly not sufficient to address the question, what are the political consequences, what are the lessons we have to learn from the financial sector crisis? We have not discussed it here. I guess you
Which
have,
one? There's so many.
I guess you have discussed it in another forum. But this is also a question of writing rules or not for this sector. If the biggest threat for our economy today is that the financial sector crisis turns into a fully blown economic crisis, then we have a very serious problem. So the question arises: who and who can do it? Where can we do it? We do not have the institutions. The only one I could see is that G8 would start as a core group to write these rules. But Bretton Woods simply to create new institutions is not enough. We need to have a framework that allows us to tackle the new challenges which we have.
André?
To me, G8 is passé, really. G8 is the 20th century, and the 21st century needs to incorporate indeed some of the players from G15, okay. G20, whatever. Yeah. But it needs to be something different, and I think that goes for the for the World Bank, the IMF. I think unless we manage the global community, we manage to reform them pretty soon, they're just going to be obsolete. And I think that sends us back to Brussels, to the Brussels dilemma. Because the Brussels dilemma is the following. On the one hand, one word that we often put forward is multilateralism. You know, how we believe in global governance, how we believe in multilateralism, and therefore how we believe in those Bretton Woods institutions. On the other, we have the problem of getting our act together, having one seat at the World Bank, one seat at the IMF. And the two are connected. Unless we are able to remove some of those chairs around the table and leave space for others, the others are being frustrated. And they want to create other institutions.
They might create their own institutions.
They may create their own institutions. And we see, look at what's happening in Asia. Yeah. How much do they need the World Bank today? Mm-hmm. There is the Asian Development Bank. There are capital coming directly from China, from India. The same thing in Africa. So those institutions are losing little by little their relevance, and they are losing their economic relevance because we're in a different world. They are free. There's capital movement, there is private capital, but there is also the frustration of some of those countries and we see that with the appointments of the heads of those institutions. So I think one really needs to get one act together, and quickly so.
Yeah, well, I agree. I think if you look at the span of history, you have institutions and ways of doing things that come and go. You had the Tournon-Taxis and the Fuggers who built up financial institutions during the Middle Ages, but then those got superseded by national and other sorts of institutions. And the same here in 20th century institutions that were born out of necessity after the Second World War will sooner or later become irrelevant and move on. But just like any other marketplace, other sorts of things will grow up, and whether they are instituted through multinational treaties or grow up out of necessity of just spontaneously, I think that will be we'll see how that goes.
Jim, you get the last word. You're an American businessman, so I'm going to ask you to follow stereotype and be brief.
Markets lead, regulations follow. We're not going to regulate ourselves to prosperity. We're going to let the markets lead, and we're going to then regulate when we need to deal with some trust and confidence crisis like the one we have right now in the financial markets. I think markets lead, regulations follow.
God bless you, man.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Especially market failure. What's happening?
Minus the rules of Brussels Forum. They're really not rules, they're guidelines. There's more to come. Tonight at 9:30, we have 3 wonderful night owls. One is on Russia under new leadership. One has to do with the Muslim experience in the post-9/11 world. And the third one has to do with China policy. So please come back after dinner. Dinner is very informal. It's going to be in the Crystal Palace, but it's a buffet. So you can network with whomever you want. And hopefully we'll see you all again at 9:30. Thanks.
So see you then in Brussels. Yeah?
Thank you very much.
If not